So happy to see you this morning, and we are extra happy to see Michael, who's been gone for 3 weeks. So we're ready to jump into the conversation, and boy, do I have a doozy for you today. So today's topic is when Ancestry.com rewrites your identity, or when Ancestry.com ruins your life, or when Ancestry.com opens a whole bunch of cool stuff for you. So whichever you prefer. I had a serendipitous encounter with a woman in the hardware store this week, and that was why we are doing this episode. So we just got to chatting. We met a stranger, got to chatting, and somehow it weaved its way into realizing that we both had major identity shifts because of Ancestry.com. Her father was not her father. My grandfather was not my grandfather. Different grandfather. So we had a lovely chat about that. And if she's watching today, I hope she'll comment on the chats and join in the discussion as well. So after having that, discussion, I was super excited to come back to Michael and Bernadette and open up the discussion here. And then I did a little digging. So it seems that I did some technical research. I went to Reddit to see what people are saying about Ancestry.com. And on Reddit, it said that about a quarter of the people that use Ancestry.com have some sort of life-changing identity shift because of the information that they found. And so if that is you, if you're listening, if your life has been impacted by Ancestry.com, we absolutely want to hear from you. We want to invite you on the show. We want to open up a deeper discussion about what it means to kind of rewrite the story of who you are. So, a lot of people go on Ancestry as kind of a fun, light thing. I remember when it first came out, everybody was getting Ancestry for Christmas. It was like, oh, let's see where we're from. Let's track our DNA. And that quickly shifted to Pandora's box of, look, some really amazing, wonderful things. And Ancestry provides a deep history for people that's interesting and exciting, but it can also open up Pandora's box of secrets, family shame, guilt, the whole gamut of those. So today's question: what happens when the story you've lived your entire life isn't true? And I am very excited, Bernadette and Michael, for you to kind of jump into this discussion. I'm going to start with Bernadette. Bernadette, from a psychological standpoint, what happens when identity gets disrupted suddenly, like something like Ancestry would do?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because it is stages. It's kind of like stages of grief that have been, Kubler-Ross, her books about that. So there are stages you go through when as you were just saying, it's curiosity first. And then if something comes up, there's like shock about, oh my goodness. And I want to use a story of somebody that contacted me. So this man, we discovered that we had a bit of DNA connecting us. So we were both like, wow, and it was on my dad's side. And I was like, oh, I've got some holes on my dad's side. I'd love to find out what it is. So we started looking, and we couldn't find the connection. We couldn't find the family name. And then he said to me, there was a rumor that my great grandfather and his brother were fathered by somebody other than my great-great-grandfather. And then he gave me the name, and that was my great-grandfather's name. And so we realized that the rumor that he had heard was true. What came for him next was kind of shocking, because he realized his family name, the name that he was attached to, was not his family name anymore. And I could see the look on his face. I could feel the grief he was already beginning to feel, because that's what came next. It was kind of like, the shock. And then it was like, I'm not who I thought I was. And then we talked to each other maybe one other time after that. But I could already feel that he was so upset and mad that this was information that he had to deal with now. And, and so that was something that really, I felt it was coming through to me that I couldn't feel, excited or about our connection, about, we were connected through my great grandmother, and I couldn't feel that connection because he was putting a wall up saying that this isn't good. It doesn't feel good. And I knew that it was coming from shame. So because, he didn't belong to, he was Scottish. He didn't belong to the Scottish family name that he thought he belonged to. And that in Scotland was very important. So it really was something that was shocking. And I was, I didn't know how to help him. And I was so sad because we never were in contact again. And I never got to share with him the story of, our story. So that just gives you a little bit of the emotional, psychological thing of what happens when that happens, when you discover that.
So Bernadette, I heard curiosity, then shock, then grief, then anger, and then shame. And maybe they can come in a different order than that, but that's what I heard.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that is, it is, it happens. We go through those things whenever we find out something about ourselves that, isn't true. But in the DNA, changed the way so many people had to face this. And it was deeply upsetting for a lot of people.
Yeah. Michael, anything you'd like to add to the individual experience of finding
I was just talking about that list, and we like to order things in nice sequential lists and say, oh, look, this, then this, then this, then this. And the reality is quite different. So you start there with the curiosity, and then you say the shock. But we could actually say the shock is actually the sudden impact of grief and anger and shame. And collectively, those are shock.
Absolutely.
And shock isn't a thing of itself.
Yeah.
So I personally wouldn't get too hung up on the sequencing, and it's more about how it plays out. And the story that Bernadette told us shows you how difficult this can be.
Yeah. And to expect that, when that happens, those feelings come back, they keep popping back in, as you begin to digest this information. And they, as Michael said, they come back in different ways. You don't feel the same thing. The order doesn't matter.
Yeah. And, I had a very different experience finding out that we also were not Scottish, but English as well. And my experience was different from my mother's. And then she had 5 siblings and then my cousins. So this was actually a Thanksgiving discussion. It kind of came out at a Thanksgiving dinner that somebody had traced our ancestry. So we've got these individual experiences. And then, Michael, I would love to hear you speak a little bit about how it does impact family systems.
So when we talk about family systems, the word that's often used is a constellation. And so what is a constellation? And if you look at a constellation, it's actually a group of entities moving in prescribed relationship to each other. And that's what you see psychologically in a family. It's a group of people who've unconsciously agreed to be in roles and relationships with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this, somebody who makes all the decisions, and there's somebody who just kind of bails out and lets things happen, and there's somebody who's the people pleaser who tries to calm down all the tensions. And so you have these different roles being played out. And obviously, if somebody goes on Ancestry and comes back and says our grandfather is not our grandfather, then you have it's like a ripple effect in the constellation, and so these impacts can impact people differently, and depending on how they see themselves in the family, and how attached they are to the the identity. And I it's like the so for instance, my father was born in Wales, and there's very strong Welsh cultural heritage. They're big on their sports, they're big on their culture and their singing, big on their working, the tradition of hard working and the coal mines and so on. And my father wasn't attached to any of that. So him having if he'd done a DNA test and it said that he wasn't Welsh, he probably would have been quite happy about it. So we don't necessarily react negatively to these things, but what happens is that there can be winners and losers within the constellation as it rebalances itself, as it integrates the new information, and that can cause like secondary problems we saw this with this this man that Bernadette described as going away. He's gone off, and his constellation is now in a ripple, and he's broken off the constellation with Bernadette.
Yeah.
And so, as I say, so you get these winners and losers as these systems return into balance.
Yeah. What came up for me was that I just had this vision of the summer family get together, and on dad's side, on the patriarchal side, and suddenly cousin saying, "You're not my cousin," and how even those simple things can feel, it breaks apart in many ways. And maybe I'm glad I'm not your cousin, so both of those.
Yeah, you think that it shouldn't make that big a difference, but it does.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's the relating, right? There's also, not sure that this can be tracked by Ancestry, but I'm sure you all are familiar with parents who have raised their grandchildren but the grandchildren believes that they are a sibling of the so a daughter had a child, but the grandparents raised that child as if it was mother's sister. This, I know several families that did this, and actually our neighbors did this. And we don't ever know if if that person ever found out that they were actually the grandchild and not the sister. There was also another one that I was thinking of. So there's that one, and there's the one that today we live in a world where embryos are not always biological embryos of the family, and how that's disclosed to the baby and the child as they grow up, and what that looks like for them. So we're in a technological age of multiple variations of whether or not we are of a certain lineage within our family. And then adoption is like a whole other discussion. So we've got this idea of identity, and that it is fixed. Bernadette, can you speak to us a little bit about being emotionally attached to an identity and feeling as if it is fixed?
It's fascinating. Yes, I grew up maiden name Bernadette Margaret Teresa O'Brien. I grew up, I am Irish. I was, there was just this strong feeling of being connected to the Irish people. And then, if I were to have found out that, at one point I thought I had a German grandmother, but, discovered then, but when you lose that, you think of, you think of the culture that is connected, and that is a very important part of the way that you may look at the world and the way you celebrate the world, and things like that. It can be a very strong pull, and to find out that you've lost that, or that you are I call myself an Irish mutt, but if that you are mixed, that you thought that you had this purity to who you are, these weird feelings of losing some of that who I am, and it's also the way that your family presents it. So we grew up with a very strong, we are Irish, and we talked about that all the time. It was a big part, and the guys next door, they were Italian. I mean, everything. We grew up in a community where that was how you identified yourself. And so when you lose that, or you find out that you're mixed, that this really, that you are, I say an Irish mutt because we came from all over Ireland. We didn't have one part of Ireland that was our homeland. And so, that's really where it comes from, is that you suddenly feel, that strong connection feels broken. And that it's very powerful, I think.
So, Michael, I would love to hear your thoughts as well about family storytelling. Tell us a little more about the power of family storytelling and identity.
So storytelling is like a container for identity. And without the stories, there is no identity. And so in my family, there were major disruptions in my grandparents' lives. The result was that basically none of my birth grandparents were around when I was growing up. So I had two step grandmothers. But Bernadette talks about being Irish, and the neighbors are Italian, and we weren't anybody. And there were no stories. There were no photographs because of the shame of my grandparents' marriage blowing up, and the shame of didn't even know it then, that my grandfather's father had walked out on the family, all of the stuff. So it was just, there was nothing to be seen. And what often happens when there is no identity and no stories is that people move around a lot. And so we moved around as a child. By the time I was 14, I spoke 3 languages. I lived in 4 countries and been exposed to 5 religions. And as a child, you just soak it all up, and you'd think, well, there's got to be a story in all of that. There's got to be some, But the reality actually was that there was no sense of identity in any of it. And I still, to this day, have nowhere that I can actually say that's home. That's a completely foreign concept to me, and that comes out of the lack of storytelling in the family. So identity and culture and traditions are very closely linked, and basically there were no traditions in my family, virtually no traditions. If you're Italian, you've got your Pasquale, the Easter cake, and each culture's going to say, I'm struggling to articulate them because I never had any.
Yeah.
And I don't say that as a complaint, but I'm saying it to illustrate the fact that when these things are missing or they're disrupted, you think you're Scottish, and then you discover through ancestry that you're not, and suddenly the next time that your New Year's Eve tradition comes around, suddenly you're looking at this thing and you're going, this is all a bit fake, and this is taken away, and nothing is here to replace it. And that can be really very, imagine if you're a child and your parents are doing these traditions, and then suddenly they're not, and you go, what is all that about? So the storytelling is very important, and when the storytelling gets disrupted, then the family gets disrupted.
So I want to name back what you just said, Michael. what you're describing is identity shock. And like you said, identity shock can come from a grief and anger and a shame and an embarrassment and whatever else is thrown in there. So number one, there's a narrative collapse. I'm Irish. I'm no longer Irish. We're hardworking farmers. No, we're not. I don't know what we are. Then number two is belonging disruption. My culture suddenly feels invalid. I don't. We visited the Erskine Castle in Scotland, and then I found out I wasn't Erskine, and that was a lovely place. But does it have the same meaning? Probably not. Maybe it does. And then number three is internal disorientation. And Michael, that's what you were describing. If that's not true, well, then where do I land internally? And do I ever feel like I have a home? And I actually, Michael, while you were gone, Bernadette and I had some lovely conversations about her past work experience, which was in foster care, the foster care system. And so actually, Bernadette, I'd like to have a question about that for you. Bernadette, do you think that finding out information on ancestry.com is comparable to other forms of identity disruption like adoption discovery, foster care transitions, other major life transitions?
It's so because that's what was coming up for me as where this conversation was going. It depends. If you look at adoption, adoption can be it can be a secret or can be open. And so, it depends on how that is treated, because if somebody is brought into a family as, and they create the family unit as this adoption, you are part of our family, and they find ways to bring in culture and things like that, that may be a stable way to understand, the adoption. But when it's discovered, as this woman we talked about at one point, this friend whose mother was 50 years old, and and her parents had passed, and she had a private detective call her and say, "Did you know that you were adopted?" That was a really shattering way. I think for when we talk about the kids that are in foster care, that identity is a very fragile identity just in itself. And it can be twofold, because foster care kids can maybe know who their parents are, both, and they're still in foster care. Or foster care can be that they don't really understand their identity. They don't know, they're not really connected to either of their parents, and they're just, not there. They feel the shame of not belonging to anyone. And it's interesting because you think about a foster child finding out about, maybe as they're older or even as they're young, I don't know, but finding out what their roots actually are might be very very empowering for them in some way. But it is there, the question you just asked has so many different little pieces to it. We could talk each piece at length. Is there something specific that you'd like to lean towards?
Michael, is there anything, are you thinking of anything about comparing something like Ancestry to foster care?
I think it's going to depend on the individual situation. I think it's such a personal thing that I wouldn't. They're both potential sources of identity shock and of identity confusion. The thing that's so about Ancestry is that people can go to it with just such a carefree, kind of naive way, thinking, they're just going to find out a list of names. While if you're dealing with the foster system, you at least know that you're dealing with troubled waters before you go in. And people love playing. New things come up, new technologies. It's almost like a game. And then you find out that the game suddenly has gone dark. on you, and you're, I don't know why we're picking on the Scottish, but you're not Scottish anymore.
Yeah. So, Michael, I think you said something very important, was that the approach to ancestry, as opposed to other forms of identity challenge that might even start in childhood, is that you are thinking, you've paid for something, you're thinking that you're going to, maybe some people approach ancestry where they know that they're going to find something painful, but that isn't always the case. And so support, I would love to ask our listeners, how many people sought support after they did something like ancestry? Did you experience trauma because of it? Were you actually having trouble functioning throughout your day to day after this? I don't think anyone in my family, because it was my grandfather, most of my aunts and uncles were older when they found this out, but there was there was a lot less contact between my siblings. So there were two siblings who were fathered by who we thought was my grandfather, and then the rest were fathered by this other person. So I think there was kind of an unspoken separation there, like you said, Michael, a constellation. And I think this comes back to one of those main topics, which is grief. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about grief. Michael, Bernadette, I am going to read some of the quotes directly from Reddit, and then see what comes up for you. So one Reddit user says, "Nothing terrible happened, but I feel like I'm mourning something." So what would you say to the person who was like, "Look, nothing really terrible happened here, but I really feel like I'm mourning"?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that one. So I had a very similar experience recently over the new year, when I discovered that I had an uncle who I never knew existed. And so this was my mother's. My mother had a brother who was born 2 years before she was, and he was born 6 months premature, and he died after 1 day. And so this was never spoken of in my entire life. I never knew anything about it. Now, obviously, my mother must have been told by her mother at some point, because later on in her life she drew up a family tree where this child was indicated, and then she crossed it off. And then there was another family tree drawn by her father that didn't mention this child at all. So when I was starting to put together the genealogy, I was kind of a bit puzzled by that, but I didn't register that this was a red flag at the time. I just thought, this was probably written when she was a bit late and starting to get a bit forgetful, and she's probably thinking of a cousin or something. And so I just landed on it on New Year's Eve last year, and just saw, this is a red flag, and I went straight on to the English equivalent. There's a thing called free BMD, free births, marriages, and death, and I went straight on there, and within like 2 minutes I'd found the record, and it was absolutely searing. And I knew this was. I knew that my mother had tried to find out whether this child existed. She wrote to the council in Bedfordshire, which was the county where she was born, and where where her parents lived when this happened, and it came back blank. And of course, what I found out was that when my grandmother went into labor with this premature child, she was taken to the nearest town, which happened to be across the county line in Hertfordshire. And so the record trail had disappeared, and my mother failed to pick it up. And what I felt was nothing really has happened. I've discovered the name of somebody who lived for 25 hours. nothing has been changed in the now moment, but it feels very different. And what it felt like was my mother's grief and my grandmother's grief. And it felt like I was experiencing those feelings, and I was just the conduit for those things to come to the surface and be released.
It almost feels, even though you weren't lied to, it almost often when these things come up, you feel lied, that somebody lied to you, even if the information wasn't really known, and it's something that really was discovered through it's that break in that feeling of belonging, for one.
If I could just very quickly speak to that. There was a family tree that my grandfather drew up, and it didn't show his wife, and it just showed my mother as his daughter. And under it, he had written, "One is enough."
Wow.
And there had been a second child that had passed away prematurely. And so it's almost like a denial and a rejection of the event.
Mm-hmm. It just brings up so many complicated feelings. It's a silly. I think it's kind of a silly story, but my maiden name is O'Brien, so my brothers in particular are very attached to that name, and through DNA we're to be connected to Brian Boru, who, the King of Ireland, one of the kings of Ireland, and DNA tells us we're probably not O'Briens. We're probably, and we're all Irish. I mean, I have 95% Irish in me. So it really doesn't make any difference in that, other than the name. But, I know that they're so attached to that. I haven't made a big deal about sharing it. And saying, oh, by the way, we probably, we might not be O'Briens, because literally the stick is in the ground that, we're O'Briens. And so even and it doesn't affect, there's nothing that affects us with that knowledge. But there's this sense of, I know there would be a sense of loss for them, or a sense of mourning that we, so that's an important.
Yeah, one of the other Reddit voices was, I lost a version of myself. And so, I think both of you started to answer this a little bit, but I'll ask the question directly. How do you process grief that is intangible?
One of the key thing for me is, if you can, geography is a very powerful way of connecting into a situation. So if you can go to the places where these things happen, or you can go to the cemeteries where somebody is buried, or it's a way of tapping into that energy field and bringing the intangible out into the tangible, and just seeing the lay of the land and what that looks like. Just going into a church and knowing that this person, whoever it was, probably came here. Just those sorts of things can help tie you in from this very ephemeral and yet very visceral feeling, which is kind of very paradoxical. And it's just being able to ground the feeling of grief in something solid, almost like a lightning rod.
Ruschelle and I talked about adoption, and a couple of weeks ago, and I was sharing the story of somebody who I worked with, and this is the story of the mom that found out that she was adopted at age 50. And it was her son who was grieving the loss of his grandfather, who he adored as being his grandfather. And there was information his grandfather had shared about, our family was, connected to the kings in England and things like that. And there was real grief that connected with it. Like he just couldn't understand why his grandfather, why this hadn't been shared with him. Why was this kept secret? But the processing, as he and I talked about it, we talked a lot about what the times were back then, where women didn't have the option of preventing a pregnancy. So there were many pregnancies that happened. And so when you start to use the backstory about how this all might have happened in the first place and why it would have kept secret, he began to understand. But what really he eventually, and I shared this too, took a trip, ended up in Italy, and that's where his real grandfather was from. And suddenly calls me from Italy, saying, "What's the town he was from? Where is it?" Looking for his new roots. And so he was able to take that grief that he felt so intensely, but once it processed a little bit, and once he kind of understood how this had all evolved and why somebody might have kept it secret, he then embraced the other side. And I think that sometimes it takes that kind of processing and time for somebody to come out on the other side, or at least to let those feelings settle a little bit.
Yeah, I had something of a slightly similar experience, in that my middle name is the name of my step-grandmother's father. But when we were growing up, there was no, I don't ever remember going to visit this family. And there was no photographs, no stories, nothing about this name. And for many, many, many years, I had a vague sense of shame around that name. I didn't like people asking me what my middle name is. It was only when I started doing the genealogy work and that I came to learn a little bit about the family, and that after my father's father walked out of the family, they looked after my father, and they stuck with him. They were the only people who ever stuck with him, and that I came to see what my father saw in that, which would have led to that naming, and that and now it's a name that I wear proudly.
What is the name, Michael?
It's Howard.
Nice.
Yeah, they were pie makers in Bristol. Very honourable occupation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
100%. So Bernadette and Michael, what you just described was that our identity is constructed. It's a lot of times constructed for us by our parents and by the places that we come from. It is inherited. But most importantly, it's reconstructed, every day by what we do. We really, at the end of the day, define who we are. So if we're thinking about I am as a statement of empowerment, what you do with the information and how you reintegrate yourself and make meaning out of this, what all information you're given, there's an opportunity to appreciate both versions of your family if you now have two versions.
Can I just jump in there and say that we've talked a lot about potential banana skin negative impacts from ancestry and other genealogy work, but there is the flip side as well. And I've just been on holiday in New Zealand for 3 weeks, and we've had a case of this flip side came up. And so my wife's family is from New Zealand, and we went there and we visited her uncle and his family. And her uncle, I'm not sure how it came up, but he started talking about his grandmother. And my wife said, "My mother never told me anything about this woman. I know absolutely nothing about her." And her uncle told us that in 1893, she signed a petition. And that petition was taken to the New Zealand Parliament, and the petition was a demand for the right for women to vote. And based on that petition, New Zealand was the first country in the world that gave women the vote. And my wife has always been strong on rights. She really gets, and it doesn't matter any rights. It does not matter what the right is about. It's that somebody's not being treated equally. She's always had that in her, and now we can see it in her great-grandmother. And this petition was put into a scroll, 274 meters long, which was presented to the Parliament. And that scroll still exists. And it's in the National Library in Wellington in New Zealand. And the next day we went to the National Library and we saw the scroll that had been signed by my wife's grandmother, my great-grandmother in 1893, leading to the first Parliament that gave women the vote. So that was pretty good.
Michael, I can't help but point out the possibility that if this was something that a man had done, your whole family would have known about it. Her whole family would have known about it. Sorry.
You can take that up with them. I'm not getting into that discussion.
Amazing. Amazing. What a great story.
It's a great story. And you know what it is, it gives us, I love that you brought it up, because it gives whoever is listening, who may still be in the sense of feeling grief or loss for finding information out, that that there are, when we look deeper, we are, our trees are very, there are a lot of limbs on those trees, and we are a mosaic of so many different people and so many different experiences and who they were. And when you get into your story a little bit more, there may be things that you feel like, oh, I don't really want to hold on to that one. But then you suddenly find something, you're like, oh, you end up sitting up a little stronger, a little straighter, because you realize that you have that there too. And so, Ruschelle, what you said, that we are in, who we are is who we think we are, as we understand, and we aren't defined by any tree, either side, and anything that someone else has done. It is part of us in a way, but it doesn't mean it defines us, and we can stand tall either way.
For me, it's the richness of the family narrative. Once you start to hear all the voices and not just the dominant ones, the ones who did something good, and say it's just that. Say hearing all of those parts, and some of them were small parts and some of them were sad parts, but it all adds to the tapestry.
Absolutely. Well, Michael, Bernadette, thank you so much for all of your insights on integrating after something like Ancestry.com has maybe rocked your life a little bit. So the main takeaway that I heard today, and I would love to hear yours as well, is that DNA can tell us something. It can be data, but DNA cannot tell us who we are. We really define who we are, and we're the ones that get to write the story based on the data. So thank you guys again. And if you have any thoughts about our conversation today that came up for you, you can take a minute to share those as well. Okay. All right. Well, if anyone listening has a story about Ancestry.com that you'd love to share with us, please drop it in the comments below. Reach out to us. Again, we would love to have you on the show to unpack your family story as well. So until next Tuesday, everyone have a wonderful week.